All right, welcome everyone. I am excited for this evening. My name is Andrew Gardner, and I'm the project director of the Making Baptist History Public History Project, an initiative of the Baptist History and Heritage Society. I'm joined this evening with the Society's executive director, the Reverend Dr. John Finley. We are super grateful tonight to be coming, having this event on the West Coast, virtually hosted by Lakeshore Avenue Baptist Church in Oakland, California. Tonight's webinar will feature a discussion of the recently published work, Charlotte Atlee White Rowe, The Story of America's First Appointed Woman Missionary. And we'll be hearing a lecture tonight from the book's author, the Reverend Dr. Reid Trulson, who is the former executive director of the American Baptist International Ministries. Additionally, we will hear a pastoral response reflection from someone who is no stranger to Lakeshore Avenue folks, the Reverend Sidney Webster. And following Reverend Webster's response, we'll have roughly 20 minutes for question and answer. So if you have any questions throughout the night, be sure to jot them down and save them for the question and answer period. Lastly, before I turn it over to Reid for tonight's lecture, I want to thank and acknowledge that this project is generously funded in collaboration by the American Historical Association in collaboration with the National Endowment for the Humanities. And any views, findings, conclusions, recommendations expressed in this webinar do not necessarily represent those of the American Historical Association, the NEH, or the Baptist History and Heritage Society for that matter. But we really hope that these webinars will be an opportunity to promote the study of history in the wider public, and as well as encourage historical thinking within our local communities. And that includes congregations like Lakeshore Avenue. So please remember to keep yourself muted throughout tonight's event. You can come off mute once we get to the question and answer period, but please keep yourself muted before then. And with that, I will stop my share and turn it over to Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. It is a real honor to have been asked to present tonight. I appreciate Reverend Webster, Sidney Webster, preparing to give a response, and to all of you who have joined us tonight for this conversation. I will say that the reason that I began my work with the research of Charlotte is because I was serving as the executive director, the CEO of International Ministries. And in 2013, we were preparing for the 200th anniversary of the mission, the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society, which would take place the following year, 2014. So I decided to do a little extra work in the archives, particularly focusing on the earliest years. And in doing so, I was encountered a couple surprises. The first was, I'd always assumed, we as Baptists speak of Adoniram and Ann Judson as the first Baptist missionaries, and I had always assumed that they were both appointed. But the surprise was to discover that only Adoniram was appointed, Anne was not. And then as I did a little more looking through the archives, I discovered that none of the women who were being sent were appointed. So Adoniram was appointed in 1814, the year the Triennial Convention was formed. The very next year, I discovered, is the name of Charlotte H. White, appointed as a missionary to go to Burma to work with the Judsons. And I was astounded. I thought, well, I've never heard of this woman. And the more research I did, it became clear to me that the Congregationalists were not appointing women. No other denomination or mission agency was appointing women. It gradually became clear to me that she was the first woman in all of America to be officially appointed. And I thought that was rather significant. And then I was puzzled that I had not been able to find any reference to her serving in Burma. So the question was, oh, she was appointed, did she go? Where did she serve? Did she serve anywhere? And that began the process then of research, which increasingly showed to me that this woman, Charlotte Atlee White Rowe, was a most remarkable individual. What I'd like to do is use a PowerPoint to give some visuals and do a fairly rapid scan or outline of her life and ministry. And then we can dig in perhaps a little more deeply on a couple themes. So I would like to share my screen with everyone now and begin by telling you that Charlotte Atlee was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She was the youngest of the 11 children of the Atlee family. You might surmise by looking at this house that this was an upper middle class family. Charlotte's father was a judge and would later become the presiding judge of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. Early in her life, Charlotte experienced dual traumas. When she was 8 years old, her mother died. And then 3 years later, her father died. In the midst of that double trauma, there were decisions had to be made. Where do all the children go? And Charlotte was sent to live with her oldest sister. I'm just going to go ahead here a little bit. Her oldest sister, who was 14 years older than her, lived in Rutland, Massachusetts, right in the center of the state. That sister was already married, had a family. So Charlotte moved into that home and spent her adolescence then and early adulthood in Massachusetts. I'll just skip back a little bit because I want to say that I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. I wanted to say that we don't know a great deal about Charlotte's education. One would expect that as the child of a judge, she received fairly formal education, but we don't know that to be the case. We do know that the Episcopal Church, of which they were members, was pastored by a Reverend Barton, who prepared this prayer book of morning and evening prayers. It was based on the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, but it was used among families for the catechizing and training of their children. So it's very possible that this was one of the sources of material that was used in Charlotte's education. That prayer book was printed by the Baptist monks in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. But in any case, she shifted from Pennsylvania to Rutland. As a 21-year-old, she married in Rutland. She married the brother of her oldest sister's husband, Nathaniel Hazen White, who was a merchant in Rutland. So the family started putting down roots. A little over a year later, they gave birth to a baby boy, and they named the boy after his father, the very same name, Nathaniel Hazen White. But then 5 months later, Mr. White died. And 4 months after that, the little boy died. So just as Charlotte had been hit by two traumas in her childhood with the death of her mother and father, now again in closer succession, she experienced the trauma of the death of her husband and their only child. In the midst of that, she moved from Rutland about 60 miles further east to Haverhill, Massachusetts. And it was there in Haverhill that she met the Baptists. Reverend Batchelder, William Batchelder, was very active. The Baptist Church was growing rapidly. Charlotte refers to his ministry in that time as the time of her conversion. She, as I say, her childhood church had been the Episcopal Church. She had been married in the Congregational Church in Rutland. Now she became a Baptist, and of course was immersed in the Merrimack River, which you see here. We're looking at Haverhill on the north side of the river. Bradford is on this side, the south side of the river. We know a little bit about her baptism because a lawyer in Haverhill named Leverett Saltonstall witnessed the baptism and wrote about it in his journal. Now, you know, sometimes women and men can do the very same thing, but the interpretation of their actions will be different. That's what happened with Charlotte's baptism. Mr. Saltonstall, recording the baptism, said that when Mrs. White waded into the water, she struck up a tune, which he said he thought was most unnecessary. He was a proper Congregationalist, and he thought that this was a sign of the kind of personality that she had. Now, had it been a man who began singing just before he was baptized, Saltonstall might have thought, well, this was a wonderful expression of the spontaneous spirituality of this gentleman. But for Charlotte, he said, well, she had a romantic personality, and I think that simply now has turned to religion. Anyway, Charlotte is baptized and becomes a member of the Baptist Church in Haverhill. That church was deeply involved in mission. For instance, it was involved in collecting funds to send to Serampore, India, to pay for the work that William Carey was doing in translating the scripture into various languages. So this was one of the advertisements soliciting funds. The church also had a society, the India and Foreign Missionary Society of Haverhill and vicinity, of which Reverend Batchelder was the head. And so they were getting a lot of information about the work that the English Baptists were doing in India, centered just north of Calcutta in Serampore. It's quite likely that a lot of this influenced and was part of Charlotte's call. She does say when she applies for missionary appointment that she experienced a call to mission at the time that she became a believer. After she spent some time in Haverhill, she moved to Philadelphia, and there she joined the Sansom Street Baptist Church, which was a unique church in its architecture. It was a relatively new congregation. The church was built in a circular form with a circular baptistry right in the middle. The pastor was William Stoughton, who was an Englishman who had been part of the group who had formed the Baptist Missionary Society in England. And then he immigrated to the United States. When the Triennial Convention was formed in 1814, Stoughton was named the founding corresponding secretary of the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions. That was the board of managers that met monthly to do the work of the convention. So Charlotte knew Reverend Stoughton very well, knew his wife Maria, was deeply engaged in the Sansom Street Church 4 or 5 months after the Triennial Convention was formed. Charlotte and other women from the church formed a women's mission society within the Sansom Street Church, and Charlotte was one of the directors of that. Then the next year, she wrote a letter to the board applying for membership, and she was appointed. Now, when I wrote the book, I had no idea that there was any image of Charlotte in existence. I had found no reference to it. But just last November, I discovered that this painting of Charlotte, which clearly was done before she sailed to India, is in the possession and is being preserved by one of Charlotte's great nieces who lives in the Washington, D.C. Area. So Charlotte was appointed. All of the actions of the board up to that point had been unanimous. but not her appointment. There were several people who voted against it. Now, the board had a real challenge. It was a 21-member board, 21 men who lived all the way from New York State down to Georgia. The board was going to meet every month. Well, there was no way that all of these 21 men every month could come to Philadelphia for the meetings. So they wrote a constitution which allowed a quorum of 7 men to act on behalf of the entire board. So at least one of the members of that quorum, Reverend Henry Holcomb, who was pastor at First Baptist in Philadelphia, voted against this. Holcomb shared an ideology that was very prominent both in the United States and in Britain at the time, that has been referred to as the separate spheres ideology. It was the concept that there was a public sphere and a private or a domestic sphere. And the public sphere was intended by God to be the sphere of activity for men. So that was business, it was politics, it was economics, it was anything that had a public face. The woman's sphere was considered to be the domestic sphere. That meant home, family, children, church, as long as you had the right role in church. And so the question was, is the role of a missionary in the domestic sphere or in the public sphere? Well, Henry Holcomb felt very clearly that this is a public role. And he had written earlier, he had been the author of a circular letter to the Savannah River Baptist Association when he had lived in the South, in which he discusses his views on the duties and privileges of female members of the church. And in the course of that letter, he talks about his view of the inferiority in some respects of the woman to the man. He says it's the man who is the image and glory of God, not the woman. And to appoint a woman to this public sphere role was usurping the authority over the men. Now, he quite apparently argued with the rest of the 7-member quorum that if all 21 people had been there, all 21 board members, there's no way that Charlotte would have been approved. So even though her appointment was legal, the decision was made to poll the entire group of 21. So a letter was sent out to all of them. It would take about a month for a horse to travel from Philadelphia to Georgia, and then another month to get the response back. So it took a number of weeks for the responses to come back. But as people looked at the question, and the question was, is it legal according to our Constitution to appoint Mrs. Charlotte H. White as a missionary? The responses came back acknowledging that the Constitution used the word missionary, but did not define the word. Now, the word missionary seems to have been coined by the Jesuits in the 1500s, but there was no definition given. So since the Constitution of the Baptist Board did not say, and by missionary we mean men, and we mean ordained men, since none of that definition was there, the majority said, yes, her appointment is constitutional. However, there were several in their response who said it's constitutional, it was a legal action, but I just really question whether we have enough money to send her. Well, Charlotte may have anticipated that, I don't know. It happens that Charlotte had a modest estate. Part of that may have come from her deceased parents. Part of it we know did come from her deceased husband. So she offered part of her estate to the Baptist Board on the condition that they would use those funds to pay for her expenses. In other words, the first woman in all of America to be officially appointed as an international cross-cultural missionary ended up funding her own work. And she would fund her own work for the entire decade that she would serve. About this time, the Judsons had translated enough material into Burmese that they now needed to be printing the material so it could be distributed. They requested that the board appoint a printer. And so Reverend George Howe from New Hampshire presented himself and applied for that position. He had been a printer before he was ordained and became a Baptist pastor. So he was appointed. He and his wife Phoebe and their 2 children would be going to Burma. And this was the occasion then that Charlotte would travel in that same ship to go with them to Burma. Charlotte immediately began writing a journal. I will say that this journal has only been located several months ago. So I'm even now in the process of transcribing it and learning more in more depth some of her thoughts. She begins the journal in 1815 once she got on board the ship, and it's in Newark, Delaware, and she continues writing it up through the year 1822. Interestingly enough, she starts the journal by using a pen name, the pen name Honesta. It's going to be a combination journal and copies of letters. And sometimes as the pages go along, and this is some over 255 handwritten pages, sometimes she identifies her writing as a journal, sometimes she identifies it as her diary. In any case, she clearly is intending to write a number of pages and then send them back to America to her brother, Dr. Edwin Augustus Atlee, who was a Quaker and a medical doctor in Philadelphia. She and her brother Edwin had a very close relationship, and it meant a lot to her to be able to send this private correspondence and be able to unburden her soul. And that's part of what makes her writing so fascinating. But another thing that's rather fascinating about this is that she says she's going to be writing about her missionary career. That phrase might not strike us as being particularly important, but in the setting of the time, it's revolutionary. First of all, she is owning the title. I am a missionary. Anne Judson, Harriet Newell, other women who had been sent were not appointed. They were considered to be volunteers who were helpmeets to their husbands, assistants to their husbands. Sometimes they were referred to as assistant missionaries, but they never had the official status of a missionary themselves. So the word missionary is important. The second word is equally important. She's speaking of her missionary career. This is a time in which no one would speak of a woman having a career beyond the career of being a wife and a mother and a housekeeper. So it's interesting to be looking in the journal, but also in her letters, at these hints of what she understands her call to be. Well, the ship in which the Howes and Charlotte sailed went first to Calcutta, and it arrived in Calcutta and then went about 14 miles upstream to Serampore, because that was the location of the British Baptist mission. There they would meet William Carey and William Ward and Joshua Marshman, the group of British Baptist missionaries. And the reason they stopped here was because there in Serampore was a mission press. And the press had about 16 different printing presses. And William Carey was willing to donate one of those presses for the work of Adoniram and Ann Judson in Rangoon. So they stopped in order to pick up the press and pick up the type before they would go on to Rangoon. Now, it took about 2 months for them to find a ship that could take them the rest of the way. And during that time, Charlotte began to learn to speak Burmese. She began to experience some of the culture in India, such as going to the ceremonies of the god Juggernaut. But she also met a man, a British missionary, Joshua Rowe, who had come to Serampore in 1804 with his first wife, Elizabeth. But at this time, Joshua's wife had passed away, leaving him a widower with 3 very young boys. Within those 2 months, Joshua Rowe and Charlotte were married. Now, instead of going on to Burma, Charlotte would remain in India to serve with her husband, Joshua. And we know that they were married in the St. James Cathedral, an Anglican church. They had to be married there because British law said that no marriages would be recognized as legal unless they were conducted by an Anglican clergyman. So they're married in Calcutta. They go from Serampore about 360 to 400 miles north on the Ganges River to the community of Digha. Digha is a community of about 500 homes. 9 miles to the east is the ancient city of Patna. Patna is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. This painting of a street scene in Patna was done by an Indian artist in the year 1815. So this is contemporary. This is what Charlotte would have seen in Patna. So Patna is 9 miles to the east. 1 mile to the west is Dinapur, which is a cantonment, a military fort for the stationing of British soldiers. Sometimes those soldiers were from the Crown. Sometimes those soldiers were from the East India Company. Charlotte in 1824 drew this map of the Baptist mission. You'll notice that the 2 square images in the center, which show 2 bungalows on the property. But you notice on the top left-hand corner that the Ganges River is there. And every year when the rains come, the river continues to erode the bank. There already was a 3rd bungalow that had toppled into the river by the time Charlotte arrived. So this is the place where she's going to do her work. This is not a picture of the bungalow that Charlotte lived in, but it is typical of the style of bungalows that usually had mud bricks and thatched roofs. Charlotte was an educator, and she immediately began the work of supervising several schools that were already in existence, but also starting schools. She was particularly advocating for and starting schools for girls. Most schools that did exist for local children were just for boys. Now, even in this, Charlotte had to buck the opposition of the powerful East India Company. The East India Company didn't feel that Indian children should be educated. They felt that if you educate the local population, that might potentially imperil the colonial administration of the area. And it might also imperil their profits. Many local people also were somewhat against Charlotte teaching their daughters. They were ready to have their sons go to school, but they weren't quite sure if daughters needed to be taught or in fact had the capability of being taught. So Charlotte really had to find allies who could help her to gain the resources in order to build schools, start schools, and employ teachers. The school buildings that were constructed sometimes were of mud, but other times were of bamboo and thatch. So this is a representative school. Charlotte would go out and visit the schools. By this time, there were 7 schools that she was supervising. She would be carried in a palanquin such as this. She did not like the palanquins, not only because they were uncomfortable, but most importantly, because she felt it was demeaning to the men who were doing the carrying. So as soon as she was able, she sold the palanquin and purchased a small cart and a horse to get to the schools that way. Her husband never learned Hindi. He had learned Bengali when he was living in the Calcutta and Serampore area and had preached in Bengali. But now they're further north. Hindi or Hindustani was the language, and he never became fluent in that. So instead, most of his work was in English among the soldiers at the Dinapore cantonment or people who worked with the East India Company. The first Baptist chapel that they built just outside the cantonment was very much like this. It was using bamboo walls and thatched roofs. They called it the grass tabernacle. Later, that became too small, so they replaced that with a mud brick building and finally a fired brick building, which still stands today and is used by the Indian Army. While Charlotte and Joshua are working, Charlotte has become fully fluent in Hindi. The schools that she's working with and starting are Hindi language schools. The little Baptist congregation on the mission station is in Hindi. So on Sunday mornings, Joshua goes to the cantonment or elsewhere to preach in English. Charlotte is engaged in leading services in Hindi. 1823, Charlotte and Joshua receive a letter from the Baptist Missionary Society office in London, criticizing them for having made public criticism of their fellow missionaries in Serampore, and that those criticisms were reported in a newspaper in America. Well, Charlotte and Joshua were dumbfounded. They couldn't figure out what in the world the office in London was talking about. It didn't tell them the name of the newspaper. So Charlotte thought, well, my brother will know what's going on. So she wrote to her brother, Edwin Augustus Atlee, saying she'd heard this. Could he tell her what was going on? Well, at that point, he acknowledged that he had used one of her confidential letters and had shown it to a gentleman named Theophilus Ransom Gates, who was the publisher of this newspaper, The Reformer, in Philadelphia. Gates was a religious visionary, and he believed that there should be nothing of an organized character for religion to be true. So therefore, he was against anything other than the local congregation. He felt it was ungodly to have Bible societies or Sunday schools or theological seminaries, and certainly to have mission societies. So he had already been criticizing foreign missionaries. He had in particular been criticizing the Baptist missionaries in Serampore. And he took one of Charlotte's letters, pulled an extract out to use it to prove, in his view, that the missionaries in Serampore were being unethical. He was accusing them of having stolen some of the mission property. Charlotte was dumbfounded that a portion of one of her private letters to her brother had been used in this way for anti-missionary propaganda. And she said to him in a follow-up letter, don't you remember that I had said, these are private letters? And he wrote back and said, well, yes, I remember you saying that, but you should also remember that I never really agreed to that. And you know that unless you have two people who both agree on something, then no contract exists. And I thought this was important for the public to know. Well, Charlotte was just destroyed. That her brother, with whom she had such a close relationship, would do this, would be so unfeeling. Now, just at this time, Charlotte and Joshua had a baby boy. They had earlier given birth, she had given birth to twin daughters. But now they had a baby boy, and Charlotte had named this little baby in honor of her brother, Edwin Atlee Rowe. But when she realized that her brother Edwin had been unwilling to observe the confidentiality of their correspondence, she changed the name of her baby. She wasn't able to defend herself in the press in Philadelphia, but she did not lack agency. Instead of this little boy being known as Edwin Atlee Rowe and being brought up to emulate her brother Edwin, he would be known as Judson Ward Rowe, named for Adoniram Judson working in Burma, and William Ward, a warm-hearted British Baptist missionary who had just died a month before the little baby was born. Now, very shortly after that, Joshua Rowe, her husband, died. He's buried here in this cemetery on the cantonment grounds, which you can see has been overtaken by the jungle. In fact, the vegetation is so matted and so full that we've not yet been able to find the headstone. We know there was one erected, but haven't found it yet. But Joshua dies. That means that Charlotte now is the parent, the single parent of 6 children. She is the only missionary who is managing the entire mission station in Diga. She is the supervisor of 10 schools, 10 Hindi language schools. She's doing teaching in 2 of those herself. She is leading the Hindi language Baptist church on the mission station grounds. She is supervising several local Indian evangelists who refer to her as their pastoress. She's doing all of this. She's still funding all of this work by herself. She did that for 3 years until she received a letter from London saying that from now on, any of the costs of making repairs on the buildings at Diga would have to be paid for by herself. And she simply did not have the financial means to be able to do that. And so she realized that she needed to have some changes. She could no longer stay there alone. So she wrote again to the missionary rooms in London, pleading for them to appoint other missionaries. She had a plan. She knew that if they would appoint 2 other missionaries and appoint her, remember, it was the Americans that appointed her, the British had not. If they would appoint 2 other missionaries and appoint her and give her a modest salary, not only could the mission in Diga continue to thrive, but it could expand. Now, she knew that she couldn't afford to stay in Diga and wait for a reply. It took basically 5 months for a letter to get from Diga to London, and then another 5 months to get back. She couldn't afford to stay there, going further and further in debt, waiting for their response. So she got the children on board a budgerrow, as this kind of boat is known, made her way down the Ganges in preparation to sail to India. On the way, one of the scenes she saw was a widow preparing to throw herself on the funeral pyre of her husband. She instructed the boatman to pull to shore, and she, in Hindi, was speaking to the widow and the people, trying to urge the widow to not commit sati. The crowd began to get too boisterous, and so the boat pushed away, and the widow continued the ceremony and threw herself on the fire. Charlotte takes this sailing ship to London. In London, she goes to the Baptist missionary offices right away to make her case. In the view of the officers in London, Charlotte was not a missionary. Joshua was the missionary. She was the wife of a missionary. So in their view, this woman who came into their room was a missionary widow. And unfortunately, at the end of the meeting, she left also as a missionary widow. The leaders of the BMS in London felt it would be too controversial to appoint a woman. And so she knew that there was no hope for her to return. There had been friends in India that urged her to start a big boarding school. She could do it. She could get enough income in that boarding school to pay for her expenses. But she said, I'm not in India just to live here. I'm here to do this ministry. So it makes no sense for me to come back if all of my time is spent simply earning enough money to stay here. Charlotte stayed another 3 years in England, part of the time in this village of Yeovil. I think, we don't have proof of this, but my guess is that she may have been gathering her financial resources to pay to bring herself and her children back to America. We know that she paid her own expenses from Diga to London, and she would do the same from London to Philadelphia. So she returned to Philadelphia, rented a house, and began immediately to operate a boarding school for girls in Philadelphia. At the same time, she began writing articles for the Columbian Star and Christian Index, W.T. Brantley editor. She was writing articles about her experiences in India, and she signed those articles with that same pen name that she used for her journal, Onesta. Now, after being in Philadelphia, Charlotte moved to the small community of Loundesboro in northern Alabama. We do not know why she moved there. She moved there and began teaching in an academy. It is very possible that she was attracted to the job in this academy for the sake of the health of the little boy, Judson Ward Rowe. We know that he had become very, very ill in India. It may be that Pennsylvania winters were pretty rough on this little boy who had lived all the earlier years of his life in a warm climate. Maybe the local doctors said, you need to bring your son to a warmer climate. For whatever reason, she moved to Loundesboro. She taught there. And we know from her journal that she abhorred slavery. Well, she was right in the middle of heavy slave culture in this part of Alabama. We also now know that by 1845, she made her way from Alabama back to Pennsylvania to the town of Strasburg, about 8 miles south of Lancaster, which was her hometown. There she became the principal of the Strasburg Female Seminary, which had been in existence, had then closed, and she was now recruited to become the principal to reopen this girls' school. So Charlotte and one of the twins, her twin, who was also named Charlotte, served at this school. The building of the female seminary still stands. This is an artist's rendition of what it would have looked like in 1850. Now, it was a great accomplishment for Charlotte to successfully reopen the seminary, 1850. But once again, two traumatic experiences intruded into her life. She had had the experience of her mother and then father dying, the experience of her first husband and first child dying. Now in 1851 was the death of her daughter, Esther Ann Rowe, one of the twin girls. The little girl, the girl was brought to Lancaster and buried in the cemetery of the St. James Episcopal Church, the home church of the Atlee family. The very next year, 1852, the second twin died. So both Charlotte Elizabeth and Esther Anna were now dead. I mentioned this issue of the little boy, Judson Ward. He is never heard of once Charlotte goes to Alabama. So possibly, quite potentially, he died in that period. Charlotte now was 72 years old. She left the school in Strasburg and went to Philadelphia, lived there for another 10 years, and on Christmas Day, 1863, she died in Germantown, just north of Philadelphia. Her body was brought back to Lancaster. The funeral service was held at St. James Episcopal Church, and she was buried in the cemetery next to the grave of her twin daughters. But she was buried in an unmarked grave. So what do we have yet of Charlotte? We have many of her letters. Her letters to the BMS are archived in Oxford. We now have this portrait. We now have her journal. But we also recognize that people who were writing histories of the mission work were continually overlooking her. They were continually omitting her. Reports of the ship that had sailed from the United States on its way to Burma with Reverend Howe mention him, but they're silent about Charlotte even being aboard the ship. It was characteristic in that time to refer to the man, the missionary. Even when the Judson sailed, the newspaper said that Adoniram Judson and lady departed from Salem. So women were not being accorded recognition. And for that reason, we have so little knowledge of her and of her ministry until just really these later years, as we've gone back to reconstruct these things from her life. I think I'll pause here. There's much more that we can talk about, but I'll invite a response and we'll continue to engage.
Great. Thanks, Reid. That's wonderful. I'll turn it over to Reverend Webster.
Good evening. I bring you greetings from Lakeshore Avenue Baptist Church and my pastor, Jim Hopkins. I thank you so much for this book. I read it once and I'm going to have to go back and read it again because it has so much information and it's so dense. And as a woman in ministry, I had to sit and reflect on some of the writing. I was thinking about all that Charlotte had been through. She was orphaned by 11, lost both of her parents, lost her first husband and her son, became a single mother of 6 children. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, lost that husband and went on to lose more children. But what I'm particularly struck with is after losing both parents, she turned to God. I find it really astonishing that after becoming orphaned at such an early age, that she became such a devout believer. And that when she was baptized, she went into the water. She was plunged, as it is written in the book. She was plunged and went in singing. And I just thought that is just so beautiful and such a beautiful way to characterize her life and her work throughout the rest of her life, that she really was a committed believer. I noticed also that, she was a woman of means, but she could have used that means to travel to India or to travel anywhere that she wanted to, not as a missionary who was using it as a career or wanted to establish a career, but just as someone who was being sent. But instead, as you say, she wanted to make sure that she was being honored as a missionary and that she was being acknowledged. And I think that is so important, because if she were not acknowledged, then probably women like me would not be here. We would not be able to be acknowledged in our ministry. I think for me, I had this conversation with a young man recently who told me that he preferred to be referred to as minister. And I told him respectfully, I prefer to be called pastor, because when you call me minister, it takes away my education. It takes away the fact that I did work very hard in seminary. I do hold a master's degree and I am ordained. And so I like to be called pastor or reverend because it acknowledges the years that I put in, and women all over the world have fought so hard for. I love in the book that you talk about why it's important, the work of the missionary, not just to be sent, but also to be appointed. And you say appointed missionaries were agents of the sending body from whom they received instructions and to whom they were accountable. And likewise, they were financially supported, and through this, they could fulfill their work. And I think that is so very important, especially for a woman traveling that far, that she had someone that was guiding and protecting her and someone that was looking out for her. I love reading about this Holcomb gentleman who was such a hater. I mean, my goodness, he was just vicious. And so that was quite interesting, that as she was devoting her whole life to serving others, that there were others who were spending their whole time, the rest of their days, trying to push women out of, out of the ministry, that he spent so much time trying to disprove her calling, was quite frightening. I have notes everywhere because the book it's great. I have to tell you that as a woman and a woman of color, as a Black woman, I am always very suspicious of missionary work, because we can look back in history and we can see that missionary work generally has gone hand in hand with colonizing different groups. We can look back and see the work that was done in eradicating the Native people. We can look at chattel slavery in this country and all throughout the world and see that it was based on Christian principles of, changing the heathens and converting them. I look at the work that Charlotte did. I look at the fact that she funded her own projects, that she took so much time. As you pointed out, her husband did not learn how to speak the language, but she not only learned how to speak Hindu, but she learned how to write it in Sanskrit, in that, and also in the Persian cursive version. She learned how to write it, that she wrote books in that language. And so I think that goes a long way in kind of opening my mind, opening my thought process to the work of the missionary. I was really struck by the fact that she taught other women how to teach children, and that she spent a lot of time there even after her husband, passed away, fighting for her right to stay there and teach. In the book, you talk about her husband, and I love that her husband was equally as committed. In the book on page 84, he says, "I long to imbibe more of the spirit and temper of the blessing Redeemer." And he goes on to say, "I long to embrace a Hindu in my arms and esteem him as brother in the Lord." And so for me, that speaks of not only her choice to go out and serve with no hidden agenda, but also that she chose a spouse who was just as committed and lovely, and who wanted to really do good. And she did do that. I have a question for you. I'm wondering, why was it so important? You could have looked at this information and looked, at her story and just filed it away. I went on Professor Google and tried to find out some extra information about Charlotte, and there was nothing more to find other than what you have written. Why was it so important for you to dive in this deep and share the story of this woman, this first woman missionary?
Well, the more I came to know about her, the more impressed I was, first of all, of her as an individual and of her accomplishments. And the more I saw about the way in which she was being treated, it just struck me that this is very unjust, is very unfair.
Mhm.
And, you know, for instance, she insists on referring to herself as a missionary.
Yeah.
And that's a matter of, you know, calling things by their right names. So it's to me, it's a matter of justice. And I really feel that it's appropriate for us to honor her by letting people know about her life and about her ministry. I also happen to have a wife and 2 daughters and a granddaughter. And I am very aware that the issue of gender bias in many different forms is still very much alive. And so to tell the story of this woman and how she persevered
Yes.
and really had some significant accomplishments, I felt was important modeling, really, for men and women today.
You say in the book that she is orphaned, widowed, bereft of her only child, derided of her baptism, exposed to public controversy due to her gender, and accused of underhanded procedure, inconsistency, mixed motives, and insufficient qualifications. She was also accused of having a weak stamina. A lot of that criticism came early on, but some of it came also because her brother, as you say, released some private and personal letters, and he allowed them to be published in the newspaper. Why do you think he did that? Do we know why he chose to do that?
The only thing he says in his letters back to her is that he thought it was important and the public needed to know. Mm. Now, I've not been able to discover what the relationship was between Dr. Atlee and the editor of this newspaper. I mean, were they personal friends? Or was there some other connection between them? I simply don't know.
Okay. And I know that one or more of her daughters was teaching alongside her.
Yes. Yes, the first of the twins who died, Esther, did not engage in teaching, and I believe that's because from illnesses in India, her health was impaired, and particularly her eyesight. Mm. But the twin that's named after her, Charlotte Elizabeth, did teach in Alabama, and also then did teach back in Pennsylvania with her.
Okay. As soon as I read in the book that she went to Alabama, I said, oh no, she is not going to like Alabama. She's going to get out of there quick. And she went to Pennsylvania. I knew that was coming. Did any of her other children go into ministry or helped in her efforts as a missionary?
Well, of course, her biological children, all 4 of them, died before her.
Right.
But she had the 3 stepsons, sons of Joshua Rowe. Those 3 sons remained in India. They were old enough to be either engaged as apprentices or in employment. One of those sons worked as a teacher at the Fort William College, teaching English to local people. He went on with his wife to start schools, much like his mother had, and taught in several schools. One of his daughters became a missionary in India, married another British missionary. So that oldest of the 3 sons was engaged that way. The second of the 3 sons seems to have died in his early 20s. The third, the youngest of those 3 sons, was an architect and was very positively disposed to assisting the work of mission and the work of local churches. He drew up the architectural plans for a number of church buildings. He helped to fund a lot of those. So he was among those that was known as a friend of the church.
That's
He
wonderful.
also is reputed to have been the first person to introduce photography to India.
Hmm,
Kind of an interesting
that is very.
side note. Charlotte had a niece who became a missionary, Harriet Hildreth Morse, who served in Burma. She also had a nephew who served in Burma and served there for about 40 years and trained local pastors and evangelists. It was said that by the end of his ministry, he had trained something over 1,000 local people in ministry. So those were several other relatives of hers that were engaged in ministry.
All stemming from Charlotte, who forged ahead and led the way. So,
She cracked the door.
amen. Yeah. So you have access to her letters, did you say? Or-
Yes, I discovered that the Angus Library at Regent's College in Oxford is the official repository for all of the records of the Baptist Missionary Society, the British Baptist Missionary Society. And they, after Joshua died, he had been the one that was maintaining the official correspondence between Diga and London. But upon his death, Charlotte then had to take over that administrative role. So there's a large number of her letters that have been preserved in Oxford. And so that's been a tremendous resource for recovering her story.
And I'm taking up all the time. I'm sorry. I have so many questions. Where is she buried?
Well, she is buried in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The cemetery of the St. James Episcopal Church is immediately behind the church, right in the center of the city. And when I finally discovered through a newspaper article that she was buried there, I went to see the grave. And I went out into the cemetery and I found this headstone for the twins, but there was no headstone for her.
Oh,
She was buried in an unmarked grave.
wow.
I worked with the administrative assistant or secretary of the church. She went back into the records. She found the record of Charlotte's funeral being held there 2 days after Christmas. She found the record of the plot in which Charlotte was buried, and it's immediately adjacent to the graves of her twin daughters. We can wonder why it was an unmarked grave. We do know that she no longer had any immediate family in the area. All of her children were deceased, and her siblings were either deceased or lived elsewhere. So, and it's in the middle of the winter. It's in the middle of the Civil War. Possibly there were people who said, well, we'll go ahead with the burial and later on we'll come back and erect a headstone, but that never took place. I will say that the present rector of St. James, Reverend David Peck, and his wife, Cordelia Moyes, Dr. Cordelia Moyes, who is a published historian herself, have in a wonderful way reintroduced Charlotte to that congregation. And that congregation has warmly embraced her as a daughter of the church. So much so that they are in the process of a project to erect an appropriate marker to mark her grave. It will be similar in style to the marker of her twin daughters. And then beside that, there will be a bronze plaque that will give more detail talking about the significance of Charlotte.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing her with us. And I wonder if you had not done so much research, or if you had not, gone and visited and discovered that the grave was unmarked, if she would have continued to go unknown and unnoticed. And I'm convinced now that because of this book and because of the work that you're doing, that she will get not only the headstone, but, get the monument that she so deserves.
I think that you're accurate, that she would have remained unknown. The present generation of the church was not aware that there was even a grave there, since there was no marker.
Wow. I'm going to read it again, and I hope that we get a chance to read her letters if they are going to be published. I'd love to read those as well. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Reverend Webster. This was a great segue into Q&A. Right before I open that up, I will just put in the chat a link. Reverend Webster mentioned that she was going to read it again. For anyone else who would like to read it, you can get a copy at merceruniversitypress.org. Use the code MUPnews and you can get, I think it's 20%, a discount of some sort for that. So let me get us back to gallery view. I'd love to open it up for questions people have for either Reverend Webster or Dr. Trulson. I see Dale's hand.
I want to thank the author so much for this. It's not only a remarkable bit of historical research, but I think it's important because it's not just finding more things about someone about whom we knew little. It's bringing to the surface and bringing to our awareness someone of whom we knew virtually nothing. And I think that's a most significant contribution. And I thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, other
And
questions?
to add on to what Dale says, it's just bringing to life someone that you never knew about. I'm not a Baptist by my background, but I am now. But it's just really good to hear the details and really bring someone's real life to light.
Thank you. I think I see Jesse's hand.
Yeah, I'm very curious. 4 children died before and I know losing a child is a horrible thing. Do you have any information of what the children died of?
No, I do not. I do not. And that's an area that some potential more research can be done. For instance, in Rutland, Massachusetts, was there an outbreak of some illness that, were there other families that suffered deaths right around that same time? That piece of research simply has not been done. And I've not found anything that indicates, as I say, I have no information about the death of the little boy. And while we know the death dates of the twin girls, we don't know the cause of death.
Thank you.
Yeah, Reverend Webster.
Me again. Is there any monument to her in India or Burma or anything that we can, besides the building?
No, there is not. I went with a group of about 10 people to Calcutta and Serampore, and then up north to Digha to see what we could find. The only physical remain was the Baptist chapel on the cantonment, on the military grounds, which, as I said, is now being used by the Indian Army. We know that Joshua Rowe is buried in the cemetery and that he had a headstone, but we've not been able to penetrate the jungle vegetation to find his grave. We went to the spot where the Baptist mission stood But over the course of the years, the Ganges continued to erode the bank so that that entire area where their houses stood has fallen into the river and has been washed away.
I just want to thank you again for, lifting up the work of this woman who is a missionary, because I always think of the quote by Desmond Tutu. He said, when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and they said, let us pray. And when we closed our eyes to pray, we opened our eyes and they had the land and we had the Bible, or something like that. And this woman did all of this work, and we know nothing of her. So
Charlotte was very committed to the empowerment of the local people.
yeah,
And within that, particularly the empowerment of women and girls.
and boys as well.
And boys as well. Yeah. But the boys didn't face quite the kind of prejudice as educating girls.
Other questions? Yeah, I think Marie.
Hi, let me know if there's background noise. I just wanted to say thank you as well to, I'm not sure, is it Professor Trulson?
Reid is fine.
Reid, okay, I just wanted to say thank you to you, Reid. I had to join a few minutes late, so I didn't hear the introduction. This is amazing to find this all these years later, and we know nothing about her. And so I wanted to just add my thanks that you've brought this incredible woman into the light. It's amazing. And I come from a long line of varied ministers, Anglican and Baptist. So it's just very interesting to me as well.
Your grandparents were missionaries also.
Oh yeah, all right, throw that in there. My grandparents were missionaries in the Philippines from 1924 to 1941.
Okay.
And my grandfather helped translate the Bible into at least the New Testament anyway, into Visayan. So thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Reid, and thanks, Sydney. Very, very helpful discussion. I was reading the book and I found myself depressed, and I was like, why? I think I was just so taken by the hardship that generation endured. I mean, the simple travel was so arduous. I mean, the work itself was beyond arduous, but just the travel was so arduous and dangerous. I said, gee, I complain about, I had to be on 3 Zooms today. I was kind of put myself in perspective. But do you have any sense how she might talk about how she was different after 10 years in India, how she herself was changed? Do you have any inkling that how she might describe her own?
Well, certainly she recognized that it had a tremendous toll on her body. She indicates in a letter just before she leaves India to go to London that some friends whom in India, whom she had not seen for a couple of years, came to see her before she departed, and they didn't recognize her. So just physically, that experience of that work had taken a toll on her that way. I would say that she leaned into her sense of call. She doesn't strike me as a person who is trying to gain a lot of attention to herself. But she's very clear that God has called her to this work. And she says, her desire was that she could be useful. And later in her years of service, she says, you know, I'm like an ant. She refers to the big ant hills on the Indian plain. She says, I'm like one of those ants. And I do a little thing. I do many little things, and many people do many little things. And the result is something significant. And she goes on to say, I'm a mere instrument. And if God does not choose to use me, I can do nothing. But in God's hand, God can do great things. So I think that sense of the presence and the present action of God in her life and in the life of others would be something that she would continue to give witness to once she came back.
Great, thank you. I think I see a hand from Steve.
Yes, Reid, this is the third or fourth time I've had the opportunity to hear you make this presentation. And every time you do, you've discovered some new things. And I appreciate the fact that your research hasn't ended just because the book has been published. I'm curious about your transcription of her journal. Is there anything that you've learned that has either changed any initial impressions you had, or that markedly reinforced some of the initial impressions that you had? What are you learning from the journal that might change some of your future presentations? I'm wondering whether I should bother to listen to you anymore, is what I'm asking.
It's always good to interact with you, Steve. Excuse me. There are, of course, a number of fascinating stories that emerge from her journal. One of which is the manner in which Joshua Rowe proposed to her. You know, I said in the book, she met him there, and within that 2 months, they were married. Well, the journal lets us know that Joshua Rowe proposed by writing a letter to her. Now here, he's at Serampore, she's at Serampore, but he writes her a letter. That actually it says something about his character, that he doesn't put her on the spot. He gives her space to think and to talk with other people. And so she goes immediately to William Carey and talks to William Carey about the proposal she's received and asks, what kind of a man is this Reverend Rowe? And so she gets a character reference. Carey speaks well of Rowe, and but he says, but you know that once two people are married, you know, there will be times of friction. So your marriage relationship must be marked with grace. He says, my only request would be that you give him an answer fairly soon. You don't keep him waiting. Well, she views a number of things as being the providential working of God. And so she accepts his proposal. From that point on, they begin to get to know each other. They go for walks in the morning and in the evening. And it's during that time that she discovers why he was at Serampore in the first place and why he was there with the three boys, because he was working up in Diga, where his first wife died. And he tells her that he had written a letter to a woman in England proposing marriage. And he invited this woman to come to India. And he thought that she might either be arriving or be sending a message about that time. And so that's why he took advantage of an opportunity, got his three boys together, and they came down to Serampore to meet this woman coming from India or from England. Instead, a ship from America arrives and he meets Charlotte White, who he immediately senses, this really is the person that I ought to be marrying. But yet he was already under obligation because he'd proposed to this other woman. Well, about 2 weeks later, another ship from England comes bearing a letter from her indicating that she had married someone else. So now he was free to even consider a potential life with Charlotte, but he was also under a time crunch because he knew that as soon as the Americans identified a ship that could take them from Calcutta to Rangoon, she'd be gone. So he had to act fairly promptly, but he also did it in a way that shielded her, that gave her space to pray about it, to think about it, and to talk to other people about it. So that's just one of a number of delightful little
Well, that's
stories
great.
that come
So I'll
along.
keep signing up for these presentations because you have something great new every time. Thank you, Reid.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Allison.
Yes, thank you, Reid, for this. I'm curious, you've been around a lot of missionaries. You've worked with them for a good portion of your life. You talk about the uniquenesses of this first female missionary and her humility and the way in which she approaches mission. And I'm just curious, to what extent is her take on the work she does unique among missionaries? In what sense do you think her having to fight to be a female shapes her experiences? Certainly she's not the only missionary who comes humble, but there's a uniqueness about her. Talk a little bit about her, what shaped her and what made her unique from others, other missionaries of the time.
Well, I think that her perspective on the sovereignty of God is an important theme that certainly emerges from her journal. And it's picked up a little bit in the sense of her talking about providential acts of God that put her and Joshua in the same place at the same time and, led to their marriage. But that's just symbolic of her strong sense of, God is not this transcendent being off someplace that's not involved in our lives. God is very much involved in our lives, and God is the one that brings changes in our own lives and in the lives of others. So, and she understands, even though she refers to her spiritual experience in Haverhill as her conversion, she also is very aware that she is still growing, that she is still being shaped by the Holy Spirit, who is continuing to work on her to shape her into the image of God. So she recognizes that in herself, and that impacts the way in which she interacts with others as well. She says very clearly that while she's called to this work as a missionary, the fact is that one Indian evangelist is worth 10 foreign missionaries. In other words, she fully affirms and encourages the work of the local people. And she sees herself as someone who comes alongside to give help and assistance where that may be needed. But it's the local people who really are the life of the church. And I think that helped to keep her grounded. And it was also important because if you think of the number of people that she could count as having come to faith in Christ directly from her work, it was a fairly small number. And she mentions that several times. And she says, I view my work as though I'm planting a crop in the middle of the winter. I'm sowing seed, but it's in frozen soil. But when the sun of righteousness shines upon it and warms it, it's God who will bring the increase. So she is not distraught. She has this confidence that she's a small part of the work that God is doing. And again, as I say, I think that's part of what kept her grounded.
And
Remember that,
perhaps
remember that missionaries at this time, it wasn't as though there was a school you could go to or a course you could take in how to be a cross-cultural missionary. This is all pretty new stuff. Missionaries from the United States would read the life of Jonathan Edwards' life of David Brainerd, or they would read of the ministry of John Eliot, both working among Native American nations. They would read accounts of different ship captains, and that was important to give them some knowledge about the countries, other countries around the world. There's so much we take it for granted. She writes to her brother Edwin early on, and part of the instructions that she and George Howe were given by William Stoughton is write often. Don't just write about the work you're doing, write about the culture, write about the history, write about the customs of people. So she writes to Edwin and she talks to him about this really cool fruit that she has become acquainted with. It is called a banana. And she talks about how you peel it from one end to the other and then you eat the whole thing. And she tries to describe these flavors. She tries to describe a pomegranate and what it tastes like and all of these things. You know, they were learning while they were doing. They didn't come prepackaged with all sorts of training.
thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that question and response. We are right at time. This has been fantastic. I am sure you can reach out to Reid if you have further questions. I'm sure he'd be happy to engage in further conversation. You can get a copy of the book at Mercer. Oh, we need to give a round of applause, Zoom applause to Reid and Reverend Webster for their responses. Thank you all so much. Please get a copy. I've also put in the chat a link to the Baptist History and Heritage Facebook page. This is our 10th webinar in this series. They're all on YouTube, so you can find them through the Facebook page. Like and follow. We've got 2 coming up that will conclude our series. In 2 weeks, on Tuesday the 28th, we'll be virtually in Kentucky, but through the power of Zoom, you all can join too, looking at a book on Kentucky Baptists. So with that, please like the Facebook page and get a copy of your book. And thank you all so much for joining us. Have a good evening.
Good night.